Hi everyone, I'm Keeno. Welcome to my studio here in Bristol. Today we're going to walk through a track called Jungle Ballet, which is taken from my new album All the Shimmering Things. And it features heavily some string samples and some jungle breaks and some classic jungle sounds like Reese and 808 bass sounds. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, stick around. So today we're going to go through a track called Jungle Ballet, taken from my new album All the Shimmering Things. And it's a tune that had a very strong concept behind it from the get-go, really. I wanted to create a ballet sound world in the introduction. I wanted to draw inspiration from some of my favourite classical composers, and I wanted to make a quite intricate string arrangement in the introduction, but also blend all of these elements with a jungle background and a jungle, the jungle 808 sounds, the jungle Reese sounds, and the jungle breaks. I wanted to incorporate all of this into one project, and I think it was successful because I had a very clear idea of what I wanted before I went in, and it really helps because the whole project was kind of finished and written in about 8 hours. So, and then the arrangement and stuff the mix down process that followed took quite a while to get exactly right. But the writing process was made easier by having a very clear idea of what I wanted before I went in. So I've highlighted the first 49 bars of this arrangement, and this is the introduction, and basically it is made up of just the strings, the chamber strings, and a few drum elements, and then later in the introduction some effects elements. As I mentioned before, I really wanted to make the focus the strings in this introduction section, and I wanted the arrangement to be kind of intricate but also delicate, like a ballet dancer. So a lot of the intervals between each note are quite large, but the emphasis between those two notes is quite soft, so you get quite a lot of expression between the two notes, but the actual dynamic isn't really getting any louder. So if I just play you the string parts from bar 17 to 33, you'll hear the music in its entirety all built up on top of each other, and then I'll kind of break it down part by part. So the loop works really well because the chords lead into each other and lead you into the start of the next chord sequence. So it's kind of a nice cycle, and also the string parts, because they're overlapping and they're having a dialogue. It keeps the momentum going forwards without it necessarily being too busy, which is something that I've been trying to focus on in this particular arrangement. So to break these violin parts, these string parts down one by one, I'm going to start with the first violin. This sounds a bit like this. So the first violin part repeats in 8-bar chunks and is relatively simple in terms of its melodic structure. It's just a descending third, minor third, and then a descending minor third again, and then I flip that third on top of each the other way up, so it becomes a sixth, and then it's just rising in step, in tone, and then another tone. So the chords that are it's following are mirrored by the double bass part, which is underneath it. So if you listen to these two parts together, you'll see the kind of harmonic structure a lot more easily. So the combination of these two parts makes up an F minor chord first, and then we've got a C major chord here with the G, the E natural, and a C in the double bass part, and then we've got a rising semitone into a D flat major chord, which is why the string parts kind of seem to slide from one chord to another. There's lots of chromatics in here, so instead of it just being standard chords that are mapped on top of each other like triads, they were adding kind of dissonant notes and dissonant notes of the scale in to make the harmonic structure a bit more interesting. Upper semitone. So those are two bass parts, sorry, the bass part and the violin part, there's two parts. And then adding into that, we've got the viola part, which is adding a lot more harmonic interest to the overall sound, but it's basically mirroring the first violin part in terms of its rhythm. So this viola part is actually quite crucial because it's playing the harmonic notes that are staying consistent throughout the whole chord sequence. So without the viola part, the whole arrangement would kind of sound a bit hollow. So if I play all the strings without the viola part, you'll see what I mean. And the viola. So having just taken the viola part out of the arrangement and adding it back in, you kind of get the feeling that the middle of the texture, the middle of the arrangement, where the most harmonic activity is happening, becomes a lot thicker, and it's a really good technique that I've found, and I've kind of learned from my classical days back when I was a kid, is that if you strengthen the harmony part, it makes the melody stand out a lot more. Usually the melody is the most dominant force behind any piece of music, but actually if you make the core of the arrangement where the most harmonic activity is happening, if you bring that out a little bit, it actually makes the listener pay more attention to what's going on in the melody and kind of bring it out themselves. So the whole arrangement kind of gets a bit thicker and a bit more interesting without you actually having to emphasize the melody yourself or bring it up in decibel volumes. So that's a kind of a little easy trick that you can experiment with any instruments. It can be piano, it could be strings, it can be synths, it can be even drums if you want to bring out the shuffles in the middle of your drum breaks. Just try and experiment with bringing out the details in your music a little bit rather than trying to focus on the things that kind of are always there, like the melody and the bass line. So going back to these chamber string arrangements, the last part I need to go through is the cello part. So the cello part I use as a kind of, again, an emphasis on this middle part of the arrangement. Often the cello part mirrors or copies another violin part or a viola part, just because the cello itself as an instrument, as a physical instrument, has quite a large range, so it can play very high and it can play very low. It's actually one of those instruments that sounds really, really nice quite high up in its register, and you get a lot of thickness and a lot of interesting sounds out of a cello if you play it slightly out of its comfort zone. So in this particular arrangement, the cello is playing relatively high in its range. But as you see, the cello is quite flat. It's not actually adding too much dynamic to the sound. It's just becoming a harmonic bass along with the viola, and then the dynamics come from the bass part and the violin part that kind of arch over everything else. So if you add all these things up, you get the chamber string sound. And the sounds that are being used here are in contact 5. I'm using Spitfires chamber strings VST, and it's one that I've recently acquired actually, and it's probably my favourite purchase of 2017. It definitely was the key part in all the shimmering things in terms of the production. And it really helped the cohesiveness of the album sound, because I was using the majority of the music in all the shimmering things was created using this VST instrument and using its full range of sound. I was able to get a lot of variation in the album without necessarily using many different VST instruments or having a massive library. And it's credit to this VST instrument really, because you can get so many different sounds out of it. I could spend an hour just talking about this single VST instrument, but I think I'll save that for another day. In terms of the arrangement here, the violin part is a solo violin, and the viola, cello and bass parts are all ensemble patches. So this kind of, again, brings out the solo nature of the melody and highlights the top part of that texture. So this cello part in the middle here, it's actually a combination between the first violin part, which is up here, and the viola part, which is underneath. I'm highlighting the notes there. I've actually lifted the notes directly from violin 1 and the viola part, and as I mentioned before, the cello is really just adding a thickness and a texture to the overall sound, and it's not adding too much dynamic. So I didn't want to overcomplicate the harmonic structure anymore by adding any lower notes or any additional harmony notes. It's just kind of a backdrop and a nice core to the chamber string sound really. So whilst this chamber strings section is going on over the main section of the introduction, the other stuff that I've got going on is just some quite simple hi-hat loops, and then later there's a single vocal. The drums are made up of loops that I've got on my hard drive, and in fact there's just 2 of them in the introduction, so nice and simple to go through. One of them's a hi-hat loop, which is a half-time one with a little bit of swing, which is quite nice. I wanted the swing because it kind of it emphasised the looseness of the strings and the way that the strings kind of fall into one another. So I didn't want to just have a straight quarter hi-hat. I wanted something that was a bit more reflective of the string sound. So that's why I chose something with swing. If you listen to them with the viola part, you'll kind of understand that. It kind of prevents it from just being a quarter or half note based introduction. It breaks up that monotony a bit. And then as all the strings start entering, we've got a mystery break, or mystique break as I've got it called here, which is, I think, just got a little bit of, it's just basically a slightly high passed mystery break along with the triplet, the swung hi-hats. So nice and simple, but together it really does suddenly bring that jungle sound to the introduction, using that classic break and having it really prominent. So it was just simplicity, and simplicity is the reason why the introduction becomes so energetic, is because it builds up from basically nothing to in the end quite a lot. So from just one classic break to later combining all those classic sounds, it really does make for quite a dramatic like energy build. So this is all part of the transition from going from an introduction to a drop section. You want to start introducing elements incrementally or by step or whatever. You want to try and automate things so that they come in smoothly, or you want to just bring something in exactly on the bar. It's all up to you. But if you want to just make a more effective introduction, I would say try and keep things as simple as you can first and save the really dramatic effects for your drop later on. As the introduction starts to build, the drum textures are quite simple and the string textures are quite intricate. So I wanted to just bring in a load of effects that were kind of just adding tension but not necessarily distracting the listener too much. So a lot of the effects that I've got here are just from sample packs or from stuff that I've made in previous years. One of them's a white noisy kind of thing that starts off nice and quiet, ends up really quite super loud. And another one is a string sample, which is quite spooky. That's really adding a kind of dub delay effect in the transition from the introduction to the drop. It's kind of just extending the violin notes. It's not really an effect that I wanted to bring out. It was kind of just a more of a background thing. And then we've got another effect here, which is another kind of white noisy thing, but it's got a really prominent resonance in the mid kind of area. So that was kind of just something that stood out in the sample pack. I think that's from a Blue Martin sample pack. Lovely. And the other thing is just a nice cymbal sweep. And I've got a little bit of reverb over the effects onto the drop, just so that there's not kind of a clean break. It kind of flows a bit better. I think there's only reverb on the Static 4 from Static 3/4 sample. You can see that though. So how does the tuning of the dub delay-ish string sound work with the string sounds that I've got and already written? So the sample was from a Ray Keith sample pack, I think, and it's originally an F sharp. But what I've done here is simply use the Cubase transpose function and transpose it down a semitone from F sharp to F natural. And the chamber strings section that I've written here is in F minor. So the two lay up quite nicely, so I can hear those two things in conjunction now. As I said before, it's kind of just a delay kind of texture, so it's not really the harmonic content that I really wanted to highlight. If I turn these up in volume, you'll notice the sound a lot more clearly. But it's really adding just like high mid content to the string sounds and building up the intensity in the high mids, so that when the sub bass comes in on the drop, you kind of get that suction from really high frequency stuff to the emphasis on the low frequency sub. And that's quite a standard way of achieving an energetic drop. You just bring all the sounds up to the high mids and then you bring in a big sub note at the bottom. So these samples are all just really aiding that process. So how come I decided to write this in the key of F minor? F minor is one of the most standardized drum and bass keys. I'd say it's what quite a lot of drum and bass is written in. Really, on the All the Shimmering Things album, there isn't many standard drum and bass like bangers or any standard drum and bass like rollers or anything like that really wanted to stand out and really wanted to aim at DJs and wanted to make sure that they were playing as much as I could. But this was one tune when it came out, and I was like, really, I think this will work in loads of different people's sets. So I just wanted to put it in a key that lots of DJs regularly play, and wanted to make it in a key where the bass was nice and thumping, and where the subnotes weren't too low or too high. So yeah, F minor just kind of seemed like a nice settled key, and it wasn't like a key where the violins were sounding too stretched or where the cellos were sounding too stretched. It was kind of just like a nice compromise between all the elements in the track, really, I think. So as the build up gets going, I've introduced one other string part which I've just put on a different channel for more arrangement and ease's sake. I could, if I wanted to, put this MIDI into the other cello part and use the triggers in Spitfire's chamber string VST to change from one type of sample to the other. But in this instance, it was just easier for me to duplicate the audio channel and select a different sample, because it made it more clear to me visually where the build-ups and the drops were actually going to happen. So this was just like a purely visual decision. So this is a cello spiccato sound. Basically what the cellos are doing is just moving really, really fast across the strings on a cello, and they are in time with the tempo, which is 173 BPM. And so you get this kind of added intensity as the string notes go from being quite long and drawn out to quite short and intense. So that was really the only addition to the chamber string sounds that I wanted to add. The rest of it is literally just the core idea that I came up with before I came to the computer. So the cello spiccato, I could have had a kind of tremolando effect, so really just light on a cello string, and I could have had that tempo synced using Spitfire's chamber string VST. It's like a ready-made tempo synced sample, but that sample didn't have enough bite to the sound, didn't have enough like really crunch to it. So what I used instead was the spiccato sample, which is a lot more aggressive and a lot more kind of has a lot more attack to the sound. And then I went in and automated the velocities of those MIDI parts to make the crescendo, the volume, get louder towards the drop. Yeah, so the velocities of these MIDI parts are really just emphasizing the first and the middle and the last beat of the bar. So it's going on 1, 2, dun 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 dun, and instead of it just being on the bar, it's just off the just off the bar. And then all I did was just highlight the whole thing and use the lovely Cubase ramp function, which I absolutely love, and just slightly increase the amount that was the velocities were taking into place, and just created a nice ramp up to the drop, nice and easy. Of course, the velocities are triggering a different sample in Spitfire, I should mention, so it's not something that might happen with all the different types of software that you might be using. It's just like in this case in Spitfire, chamber strings using a high velocity triggers a sample which has even more attack or even more grit. So that's the reason why it's ramping up the velocity towards the drop. Otherwise you could try just raising the volume, or you could try some filter work, which is what I'm about to go into. So the delay on this spiccato is actually in the group channel that I've sent all the strings to. So I've grouped all the strings together in a chamber strings group, and there's a variety of effects here that I've added. The bottom three are more mix down choice plugins, and then the top two are effects, especially for the drop section. So I've got Effectrix here, which is only used for the vinyl kind of spin down effect right at the end of the sample you heard. So this little tiny, just that little tiny spin down section, which just added something a little bit extra to the drop and kind of made it seem a bit more jungly, I guess. I don't know. That's just literally automated using Cubase's automation system, and it goes from 0% mix to 100% mix on the last bar before the drop. So that's just a nice simple spin down at the end. And the delay that's on this channel as well, on this group channel, catches that spin down and delays it in over the drop. So you kind of hear that sample tailing over the drop quite nicely. The delay plugin I'm using is Isotope's Dynamic Delay, and I think it's probably one of my favourite delay units. It's something that Hugh Hardy introduced me to, and I've been using it ever since, and I freaking love it. It's got that kind of dub delay classic sound to it, and it's got a lot of functionality. The only thing that you need to be wary of is sticking the feedback and the trash too high, because you'll just get like endless ringing frequencies and endless delays that just feedback forever and will hurt your ears. Fortunately, there's a panic button which you can hit and it will just stop all delay. So if you're worried, just hit the panic button. So I reckon if I try and play this build-up section, you'll see, yeah, you'll see everything automating. It's got quite a nice sound to it, and I've left the low notey harmonic content out of the delay sounds, so that the delay just kind of carries on into the high mid-tone ringing frequencies, and that's kind of filling in gaps that may be in the drums or filling in gaps that might be in the bass. It's just kind of like an extra effects basically that kind of just tail the drop section into tail the introduction section into the drop. The only remaining element in the introduction that I haven't gone through yet is the vocal, and the vocal is also from a sample pack that I acquired probably on day one of my production career many years ago, and it's one of those like weird operatic kind of samples that doesn't quite fit into any tune that I've managed to before, but this one just had that kind of haunting church or ballet or classical sound to it that I kind of, it just caught my ear, and it sounds kind of like it was sampled from an old vinyl record, I guess, or maybe like an old classical recording. I can hear So it's got loads of effects on there, really long reverb, and lots of auto-tune and some delay and some compression as well. The vocal is heavily auto-tuned because the original vocal sample wasn't in tune with the strings basically. So what I did was just use Cubase's Vary audio function and dragged and dropped the pitch and dragged and dropped the notes into key with the strings. So I think the original key all the notes were different basically. So I literally have just composed the vocal again using its sounds and then re-editing each of its notes. So the first note's an F, and then it goes up to a C, which is a perfect fifth, and then it goes down into the third, so it makes an F minor triad. And then ends on a nice dissonant note. So you get that kind of semitone crunch, which is like nice and dissonant. You can really hear that with the delay in the vocal. But you can hear those two notes getting quite nice and prominent. And they're also in those effects that I showed you earlier. So that's kind of just like a nice mirror. But yeah, the vocal only appears 4 times in the whole song, and it's only a few seconds long. But I think it just adds that extra layer that signals the transitions between each of the sections, and kind of gives people something else to listen out to when they're on the dance floor or sing along to or something. So yeah, it was just, I think, probably the last addition to the whole arrangement, but and it needed a bit of shoehorning using processing and tuning, but it's not really super prominent, and it's not got a lot of high-end content to it. It's just a nice mid-ringing frequency that carries on over the drop, and yeah, a nice little addition. Right, that's it for part 1, guys. If you want to learn some more about this track, please join me for part 2.